Okay, this is part one of a two-part presentation on liberation psychology, introducing liberation psychology. The aim of this presentation is to position liberation psychology within that broader context of human development, and also to position it in relation to psychology as a science, and also in relation to the mental health professions. Um, so I'm going to begin with the question, what is psychology? And this is because if you look into any Western psychology textbook, you'll find that psychology is defined as the science of mind and behavior. But in the context of liberation psychology, it seems more appropriate to have a broader definition of what psychology is. And so therefore I've adopted the definition of psychology as being about thoughts, feelings and actions. Um, so, in relation to the psychology as a science, I think it is worthy to point out that both feminist and critical theorists and post-colonial theorists have always been critical of science. They've introduced a very important critique into psychology as a science, and this is important because as a science, critical thinking and critical analysis are really an absolutely essential feature of the questioning, which is at the core of scientific thinking. So, um, particularly prominent, and there are many, many others, but particularly in just mentioned Sandra Bem in the 1970s, who highlighted the way that science is that psychology is a science run by men, for men, and about men, and that this implicit understanding of human nature was affecting the development of both men and women adversely. And Carol Gilligan then, who saw that psychology as a science is built on assumptions about the nature of human beings and the nature of men and women, and that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And then Ignacio Martin Barro, a Spanish psychologist who worked in El Salvador, he was assassinated in 1989. He wrote about how psychology was detached from the reality of poverty and violence of people's lives, of the lived experience and the psychological suffering of people. And he was also very critical of psychologists who he thought were often too preoccupied with their careers and too preoccupied with their publications. Um, then liberation psychology in relation to mental health professions. It's worth noting that there are different traditions, psychological traditions, including the scientific tradition of psychology. So mental health professionals fall into clinical and counsel psychology. They're the psychological Western model. Psychiatry, which is the medical model, the psychiatrists are medical doctors. There's also psychiatric nursing, and psychiatric nursing often overlaps with psychotherapy because there are many prominent psychiatric nurses involved in developing psychotherapy. Psychotherapy, there are several prominent schools, many different schools. And this is a field of talking therapy, of dealing with mental health problems and the problems of everyday life, of living in the difficulties and the challenges and the suffering, psychological suffering of everyday lives. So psychotherapy is currently a developing area. Psychoanalysis was the Sigmund Freud school of psychology. It's a separate school, which I don't know very much about, so can't say much about that. There's also Carl Jung's psychology, Jungian psychology, which I don't also know very much about. These are separate areas of counselling and therapy. But just to mention the art therapies, art, imagery art, performance arts, drama, musical arts, and in therapy and so on. These are hugely developing fields, and they're really important for liberation psychology because creativity is an important strength of people in terms of dealing with oppression. So I just mentioned the art therapies here. Um, Next, I just want to say that liberation psychologists themselves come from different schools of psychology. They come from different traditions in psychology. Some come from the mainstream scientific, and others from all the other psychological traditions that I've mentioned. Human development, then, I want to situate psychology within that wider context of human development. Psychological development is important for individuals to understand psychological development, but also within the wider context of economics and politics, sociology, and so on and so forth, history especially, and many more. So within that wider context of human development, we situate liberation psychology. From a psychological point of view, we see that each individual is unique and each person has a unique sense of self and identity. We're always trying to understand that. There are many theories in this area. Also, what's really essential in liberation psychology is to understand that each person is a social being influenced by the social context, and the social context includes the people around us, the person's role in the situation, and there's lots of research in psychology on the effect that the person's role that they're in has an effect on their behavior. The Stanford prison experiments are a good example of a classical study. And also the social conditions and circumstances, they affect a person's development, so they are part of the social context of development. And so just linking all of that to critical and liberation psychology. Remember, liberation psychology is a part of critical psychology. The key point is that social conditions have psychological outcomes, and the effect of oppressive social conditions is that people develop psychological oppression. This is something we try to understand in our liberation psychology class in women's studies with our group of women. We had a brainstorming session on the psychological effect of oppression, that psychological oppression, defining psychology as being about thoughts, feelings and actions, and these are the key words that emerged in our brainstorming session. They are fear and anxiety. They were hugely experienced. Anger, particularly in relation to depression, we thought was about suppressing anger very often. So what people experience more than the anger is often the depression. The detachment and the passivity, not acting, blocking of feelings, a sense of isolation and feeling weak, feeling shamed, losing one's voice, becoming dependent, lacking confidence, loss of self-worth, restriction, restriction in terms of how we can think, how we can act, what we can do, what sort of actions we can take, limitations on our thoughts and our feelings, and also this helplessness in terms of being able to change anything, leading into this acceptance of reality of oppression, a loss of hope. And all of this was from our brainstorming session, and they're all related to mental health problems, we think, and also addictions. So that concludes part one of this introduction to liberation psychology, which situates liberation psychology within a broader context of human development.